Hi, I'm Laura Whitburn. In this video we're going to trace nerve fibres through the brachial plexus.
Let's now look at how to trace nerve fibres through the brachial plexus. And let's start off with drawing the course of a GSA through the brachial plexus. Here's our scenario. When something touches your index finger, a GSA is activated that carries the sensory information to the spinal cord. Draw the path of this GSA through the brachial plexus. So here is our brachial plexus, and we need to think about how we would draw this GSA travelling through the brachial plexus to the spinal cord. The first thing we need to do is to work out which peripheral nerve this GSA is going to travel along. So we need to look at our cutaneous nerve map. And by doing so, we should see that the index finger is innervated by the median nerve. So this is where our GSA is going to enter the brachial plexus, along the median nerve. Secondly, we need to work out which spinal level that GSA is going to terminate at. And to work this out, we need to look at our dermatome map. By doing so, we would see that the index finger is innervated by the C7 dermatome. So we can now see where this GSA would enter the brachial plexus and where it would end. And we simply need to find the path that would get us from the median nerve to C7. So here we can see that if we follow this path up here, then down through there, we would actually end up at C7. So our index finger, something has touched it, and there's our GSA travelling through the brachial plexus to C7. Remembering that being a GSA, its cell body needs to lie in the dorsal root ganglion. Let's now draw the course of a GSE through the brachial plexus. And our scenario is this. In order to abduct your glenohumeral joint, you activate your middle deltoid muscle. Draw the path of a GSE through the brachial plexus that carries the motor instructions to middle deltoid. So to do this, we first need to work out which peripheral nerve will that GSE travel out of to get to the muscle. And by knowing which muscles are innervated by which peripheral nerves, we should be able to figure out that deltoid is innervated by the axillary nerve. Now the axillary nerve is made up of a number of different spinal levels. So we next need to work out from which spinal level that GSE will originate from. And to do that, we need to look at the myotome map, where we would see that shoulder abduction is primarily innervated by C5 spinal nerve. So we now know where the GSA is going to originate from, and we can follow the map until we emerge from the axillary nerve. So there would be our GSE travelling to middle deltoid. Finally, we want to consider how we would draw the course of a sympathetic GVE through the brachial plexus. So our scenario is to draw the path of a sympathetic GVE through the brachial plexus that causes stimulation of a sweat gland in skin over middle deltoid muscle. Let's first review what a sympathetic GVE is. GVEs are the type of efferent that send motor instructions to visceral organs in our body, and there are two types of GVEs, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and they have opposing effects. Sympathetic and parasympathetic GVEs originate from different sections of the spinal cord. Sympathetic GVEs originate between levels T1 to L2, whilst our parasympathetic GVEs emerge from either the brain stem or the sacral regions. There are two neurons in the chain that carry the messages to organs from the CNS. The first neuron in the chain is called the preganglionic neuron, and the second neuron in the chain is the postganglionic neuron, and there's the ganglion where the two neurons synapse. For sympathetic GVEs, this ganglion is called the sympathetic ganglion and is part of a chain of ganglions that connect to one another and run the full length of the spinal cord. Now this is really important because
having this limited region of the spinal cord from which the preganglionic neuron can emerge means that the preganglionic neuron can actually travel up or down the chain of ganglia in order to reach particularly higher or lower levels. In the limbs, we have 3 visceral organs that require innervation from sympathetic GVEs. They are sweat glands, the smooth muscle in blood vessels, and the erector pili muscles that control our hair follicles. Now let's think about the brachial plexus and where it fits into this diagram. Remember, our brachial plexus is formed by the ventral rami of C5 to T1 spinal levels. So it would be sitting up here. Now T1 is in fact the first level from which a preganglionic sympathetic GVE can emerge from the spinal cord. And so all sympathetic GVEs that are travelling through the brachial plexus to various visceral organs in our upper limbs are going to originate from T1 level. There's no other option. Let's now attempt to draw this chain of sympathetic GVEs onto our brachial plexus in order to stimulate a sweat gland in the skin over middle deltoid muscle. On this diagram, we can see 2 sympathetic ganglia. We can see a lower ganglia here and an upper ganglia up here. Each spinal nerve has a connection to one of these ganglia. So we can see connection for C5 here, for C6 here, for C7, C8 and T1 down here. Each of these connections are called grey rami communicans, and what they are exit points from the sympathetic trunk. So our postganglionic GVE will use these connections to exit from the sympathetic trunk and then travel out through the brachial plexus. Now, T1 is the only spinal segment from which preganglionic sympathetic GVEs can emerge from the spinal cord. And so they would emerge and enter the trunk at this lower ganglia here. And so this is the entry point, which we only find at this level because T1 is the only spinal segment that allows preganglionic GVEs to emerge. This connection is called a white ramus communicans. So we know that our preganglionic GVE is going to originate from T1. We know that it's going to enter the sympathetic trunk via the white ramus communicans attached to T1 spinal nerve. Then we need to work out what happens next. It has 2 options. It can either synapse here with the postganglionic GVE, and the postganglionic GVE could emerge from one of these 3 grey rami communicans, or it could travel up to the higher ganglion up here, synapse there with the postganglionic GVE, and the postganglionic GVE could then emerge via one of these grey rami communicans. This will depend on where in the upper limb this sympathetic GVE is heading. We know it's heading to the skin over middle deltoid muscle, and by looking at the dermatome map, we know that the skin over middle deltoid muscle is innervated by the C5 spinal nerve. We also know that the skin over middle deltoid muscle is innervated by the axillary cutaneous nerve, a cutaneous branch of the axillary nerve. So this gives us all the information we need. Because the skin over middle deltoid is innervated by the C5 dermatome, we know that the preganglionic neuron is going to enter the sympathetic chain and travel up to this higher ganglion. It will there synapse with the postganglionic GVE, which will travel out of the C5 spinal nerve and travel through the axillary nerve. So let's draw it now. Here's T1, and there's our axillary nerve. There's our preganglionic GVE travelling through the ventral root, entering the ganglion via the white ramus communicans, travelling up the sympathetic trunk to the higher ganglion, where it will synapse with the postganglionic GVE, which will exit via the grey ramus communicans, connecting it to C5 because that was our dermatome, and then travelling through the axillary nerve, because that was the peripheral nerve that innervates that area of skin. Here are some scenarios that you can now try in order to confirm whether or not you've understood what we've learnt today. So firstly, try drawing the nerve fibre involved in feeling the coolness of your watch band over the lateral aspect of your wrist. Then draw the nerve fibre involved in abducting your little finger. And then finally, draw the nerve fibres involved in stimulating the smooth muscle of blood vessels in the skin over your snuff box. Post any questions you may have in regards to these 3 questions on the LMS discussion forum.